Welcome. Thanks for tuning NeptuneKnives. So a lot of you guys may not know, but I have an obsession, I think, with Karambits. Overall, making knives, the Karambit is definitely a challenge. This is an ongoing debate in the knife community about whether or not a Karambit really is a superior style of knife for fighting. And as I've been researching into them and trying to make them, I've come across some insight, and I thought I would share that with you guys, and also take my experience in martial arts and apply that here. I'm going to break this down into concept, blade shape, because that's the key reason why you have a Karambit, and then the handle design, because that helps you control the blade. Traditionally, it was a farming tool. You know, it's a sickle. You would cut, and the hook here, this little curved portion, would bind all the stalks or the different plant, fibers, and it would help you cut them all. And it was helpful because with the finger ring, you could let it go, pick up what you had to pick up, maybe put it in the basket or something, and continue going back and doing your work. Also, because of the ergonomics, your wrist is straight, but the blade can still cut. So then you're not tiring yourself out by always having your wrist like this. You don't want to get, people complain nowadays about typing and they get arthritis or whatever. This is like, so your wrist is straight, it's locked, you have more power. Something similar when you learn about, if you study samurai swords and how to use them, they always tell you that you have to lock your wrist, you have to keep them kind of straight so that you can do that powerful cut. So it helps the wrist also while you're working, not fatigue too quickly. So historically it was obviously larger than a modern day Karambit. It wasn't only used in the Philippines, although this is now more of a Philippine style. It has more of a association with being a Philippine martial arts weapon. Traditionally it was bigger, it was much more like a sickle, and it was more curved. In today's standards, I would say it's a pretty good work knife. If you're perhaps carrying through carpet, some people always think of this, people who don't know knives might say it's a carpet or box cutter. And even when these knives are fairly dull, that curvature really forces branches and things like that to still cut. And if you guys are familiar with the ulu knife that's used in kind of tribal settings, it's got that knife blade where it's like this and it curves and you rock it back and forth to cut. And if the Karambit's sharp on both sides, it can be used that way too. And of course, since it's a blade, at some point it transitioned into a martial arts a style of fighting, because people who carry this would practice and use it for self-defense applications, and they came up with techniques. Some people advocate it's the best style of fighting knife. To be honest, all knives seem to be preference. Your determination on whether or not you're going to practice with it, whether you believe it's going to be the ultimate tactical knife or work knife, it's going to go off a lot of what appeals to you. I can tell you this, in my experience, in my opinion, I actually do prefer the Karambit as a superior fighting blade. The knives I make, the R-Buyer, little small hip knife, these kind of knives, I guess you would say, for me, emphasize tactical applications. And so for me, I see the benefits, tactically speaking, of a Karambit. This blade shape primarily is what does it. But I can understand why other individuals perhaps just don't like the look of it and they'll just completely write it off. But what happens here with the Karambit, the main thing is, when you're slicing at something, a traditional blade, depending on how thin it is, can graze off a surface. As you cut against something and that something resists, it pushes off. That curve actually just rolls right off. And you'll still penetrate, but it won't penetrate to the degree that something like even a tactical knives, like when they emphasize a straight edge, or like a Warncliffe, like on the Yojimbo 2s. In that same sense, with this Karambit, when you're cutting, it's rather than grazing, it's going to hook and make sure that flesh or that material does get stuck and forced to be cut by this blade shape. So it's much more effective at, I would say, snagging or tearing. And that's the key thing then now about the Karambit is, in a fighting situation, you're not just now cutting the opponent, but because you have this hook, you can control the opponent. You can slightly cut or move limbs out of the way. And that is an important aspect. If you want to manipulate someone's limb, turn them, push them in a direction, you have this curve that can almost work as like a lever. So a lot of knife makers who design Karambits, they have to understand there's a couple things as a user you need to look for, and a lot of things you're just gonna have to feel when you hold the karambit. I would say a karambit is very much something you're gonna have to hold and feel the weak points and the strong points, and hopefully this video will cover a lot of those. But the first thing is that there should be a curve. If there's no curve and it's a straight edge, then it's straight is okay, but I mean the obvious point is there's a curve so it can hook. But also then the length of the curve, the length of this blade creates an issue because it's basically a lever. And I'll use this as an example. Right? We all recognize what this is. And so in a sense, if this is the handle and here's the blade, right? That length of that blade is a lever in the hand. I mean, if this was this case, say it was a really long blade and short handle, it'd be very easy to twist my hand or twist the handle in my palm. So there must be a good balance in the way it's designed. Another key concept then of the blade shape is that when you have a traditional knife and you want to reach the opponent, you see how your wrist is already pronated, see the position where it's in. And this is obviously then, there's more leverage, you have weaker strength against this direction. If something were to push, you're already kind of in a position where it's twisted. So let's say you stab into something and they run into you, or it pushes into you and you twist your wrist or it twists out your hand. A traditional knife, when you thrust, let's say for example you want to poke a point. At waist level, no problem. You just maybe perhaps do a little thrust, right? But let's say like you want to pick at their arm. You start to see like, if I try to do a pick motion, realistically I'm only going to graze, or perhaps I have to do a slight, like a slight cut, which is a motion then that requires more time, it's a little bit less efficient, I guess you would say. If we're talking like efficiency, minimal motion, minimal telegraphing, then it's obvious when I take this blade and I want to perhaps just nick their hand or nick their arm or just jab at their face, that along with that, if the blade shape is not perhaps suited for that, for example, if the tip is raised, then it's more like when I thrust with this, I'm more hitting the opponent here than with the tip. And it'll all depend on each knife. Obviously negative angle blades, ones that curve downward, lean more towards what Karambit does, it's not such an issue. But then when you see a Karambit, you can see here, the tip is already straight. So in a sense, if my wrist is straight and the tip is already pointing out, I can basically just jab, literally just jab, and I'm picking at whatever, I'm basically poking holes in whatever surface, whether it be up high to get perhaps their temple or their eye, or it's like it's a picking motion, and I don't have to move my wrist around. I don't have to make a slight, how I say, nick this direction. I don't have to like do that. I can just literally jab, just jabbing as if I was a boxer and just jabbing. A Karambit typically, especially a tactical Karambit, will have two edges. And that's obvious. It's always good for fighting. It allows you to do two types of motions, underhand, overhand. And especially as a Karambit, I would say you need that double edge because, if, for example, I don't want to telegraph and I'm holding, let's say, for example, I'm holding it in this direction. And it's obvious then I have to move an upward motion to produce a cut. And a person can predict that the motions are going to come upward. My arm is going to move upward. And if there's no double side, then they're going to realize that I have to either twist in a very dramatic way or something, my wrist. It starts to become predictable. But when it's double-sided, I can flick up and down. It's much less predictable, especially since now this blade is positioned in this angle. When it's a standard flying knife, not such an issue because you can quickly just turn the side. If I have to cut up or cut down, it's not such an issue because it is more of it's just a straight stick rotating in my palm. When you have just a double-edged knife, it just forces you to do less motions, less telegraphing. You don't have to turn your wrist over. If I want to perhaps sweep up and this was the only curve, I don't have to do that. I can just nick up. If someone's hand comes toward me and they say I parry it down, I can just nick up. And then of course this design back here, I've seen on some Karambits, they have prongs or things like that would snag on any material, and that's not something you want if you're going to be cutting. Now it'll depend, and this is where then your preference is. Perhaps you want, when you do this motion, and you perhaps say you hook it behind their arm or behind their deltoid, and you want to pull them, then you may want that feature. I mean, you still want to make sure that if the creme moves in your hand, you're safe from getting poked in your own palm, but perhaps you want it specifically to snag something, and that could be your personal choice. A lot of people will like to hold the karambit in reverse grip. I personally don't. I feel that when you start to look at the way the blade twists in your hand, the way it acts as a lever in your hand, I feel that it puts a lot of pressure down here that your hand can't control it very well. And I also think you lose then some abilities. Depending on how it's designed, you lose the ability to jab rather than up here, down here. Some karambits may have prongs here so that when you punch with the ring, that you have that option. Again, those are design options. But when you hold in reverse grip, it starts to telegraph more. For example, downward nicks require a larger upward starting motion and then a downward cut. Upwards, obviously, when you slice upward, no problem. But when you start to have this blade down here, it predicts more. You can't do some of the advantages of having such a blade shape. I think those are some cons to holding it that way. It wasn't made for reverse grip. I mean, when you're farming, you don't cut necessarily like that. I still think you use it as a traditional sickle, but perhaps people just thought it was cool. Some person started a trend, and it's just worked out that way. And it'll be your preference whether or not you like that. I think the next thing then is the material. And in this case, it's going to have to depend on the user or the maker. In my case, I feel that a karambit should be made out of titanium. Because it's a tactical knife. If we're talking modern use, I'm not going to be using this to cut boxes and other weeds and stuff. I'll just use a compact little folding knife. But when it comes to then a fighting situation, I want something compact. And we're not talking this is going to be superior than something like a machete or something with a lot of reach. But when we're talking compact fighting knife, I like the blade, the edge performance of titanium, which its characteristic is it doesn't seem to cut you upon just touching. Like, for example, if a normal knife you sort of just push up against or slightly graze against, you'll instantly get a nick. Titanium will still shave and slice paper, but it requires like a little bit more force. It doesn't seem to snag that much as like a normal steel, but the lightweightness, the impact resistance, and the ability to kind of like manipulate a titanium knife blade. For those who have handled them, it feels more safe. It feels more in control, a little bit less unwieldy, a little bit less dangerous. And that's something important for me when it comes to something I'm going to be manipulating a lot. The steel, for example, these finer pointed karambits, such karambits out there, I'm not going to say the name, where the maker has shaved down the tip because the tip is fragile in that CPM steel. The 154 cm steel, it's not strong enough, that never was a very impact resistant steel, to handle such a fine tip. And it depends, how you're carrying this knife. For example, on mine, I have a 2 angles on the blade, because not only even though this is titanium and very like impact resistant, break resistant, I still have a shallow angle here and a more of a steep angle, a wider angle, so that there's more meat up here on the tip, so that even upon hard impacts, I'm not going to break the tip of the karambit. And that will depend on the maker. The karambit is a very specialty, I would say, knife. It requires a lot of material to make. A karambit is not like a normal knife where it's more straight, so you can use up the steel in a more conservative, efficient manner. Being that the karambit is such a pronounced curve, especially the more crazy it gets, you see how much steel has to be cut from over here to down here. A lot of steel metal gets wasted, so it's not a cost-effective knife to make. And so it's going to depend on the manufacturer. I would say the opportunity to the demand for it. In that sense, a titanium karambit is very expensive because of the material and also then the shape. So it's not cost effective perhaps, and that may also be one of the reasons why you may not see certain steels, but it just depends on the maker and what they are willing to compromise on. And then we get to handle design. There's a lot of variety when it comes to karambit handles. And to be honest, you're going to have to understand what kind of techniques you're going to use. The karambit is I would say you have to train for it. You have to specifically train to do those poking motions if you want to use that tip. If the blade is made properly and the karambit can do stabbing motions and start jabbing, then you're going to have to practice that. You're going to have to also practice how, if you want to do reverse grip, what muscles you have to use, how you have to hold the karambit in your hand to prevent it from moving around or twisting in your hand as a lever. And if you understand then the difference of techniques you can use with the karambit, which I would say are more than the traditional knife. I mean, if you understand then how to move joints out of the way, you have to learn how to do that. You have to learn how to even recover the blade if perhaps you drop it. Even the practice of perhaps getting your finger in the hole initially. There's a lot to a karambit, and I think that's what maybe among people who are, I guess, connoisseurs of knives and also fighting like open-handed, empty-handed combat, they like the karambit because it's so intriguing, it's so different. So now the typical reason why there's a finger hole is that the concept is, let's say you get socked in the face or something worse, and for a brief moment you lose focus of holding your knife. If you see training like with a Kali, a Eskrima, a stick fighting and stuff, they hit your forearm, and if you drop the stick, you've lost. I mean, it's like you drop your weapon, you're done. In the sense the karambit, one, if you perhaps aren't focusing, perhaps you get injured and it falls out of your hand, it doesn't completely drop out of your hand. You can recover, I guess, in a sense. There's also then that concept of you can grab still. Like say if you have to, say someone rushes you, and even though you want to use your knife, they've come into your very, very close range, and you have to grab a limb or grab something. The design of it allows you to still use your hand to grab, but at the same time not lose your knife. And I would say if you're going to practice, if you're going to utilize it in a way to where you're not going to drop it, then you have to practice recovering. And in that sense, that's why I like the titanium, the feel of the titanium, because I feel that as a metal, it's more easy to manipulate, a little bit unwieldy. That's going to depend upon the person whether or not they really want to focus on letting go of their karambit. I personally don't. My idea is if you're going to put your finger in it, the idea is you never lose grip of it. The idea is that's why you have this additional method of keeping it in your hand. There's a lot of techniques they say supposedly upon disarming, if the knife is to be disarmed out of your hand, that you could break your index finger if you're holding reverse grip. And again, that's going to depend. I personally don't think it's wise to go and try ever to disarm somebody by manipulating a blade and pushing it out of their hand. I think that's just, you're just asking to be cut. It's ridiculous. I've seen some tactical experts say the blade more than likely is dull because most people don't know how to sharpen, so you can grab it. Don't. But if you're in the camp that believes you can disarm a knife out of someone's hand, yeah, maybe you can, it's easy to rotate this knife in your hand, sure, but let's say it's a well-made knife that's very strong, secure grip. Some people will say that, oh, this finger hole up here, the traditional one on the back of the karambit, is a risk for breaking your finger. I would say that's true, and that's one of the reasons why I don't like reverse grip, because typically this is your trigger finger. It is more of a risk. And knife makers take that into account. On this one here, this is a 7/8 inch hole. On this one, it's a 1 inch hole, so there's a little bit more room. You could train and practice to hold it a certain way. Perhaps your finger isn't so deep into the hole. But I also prefer then the forward grip. I like to use a karambit still in this because I still want the variety of techniques that I can get from holding it this way. And if in this situation it's my pinky finger, even though it's a 1 inch hole and it was still to get snagged, it's not as, I guess you would say, devastating than having my index finger, which you can see then on here I have the open one. So it's going to depend on the maker and their concepts and what they understand about how an individual is going to use this karambit. This has turned into a sort of modern tactical knife. It needs to support large amount of force coming from different directions. If you cut and something pushes down that way, for it to not move in your hand, I would say then that typically then the handle should be wider than the blade, or bigger than the blade. It should have more width, especially down here, so you can exert more control, prevent this blade from moving around your hand. For example, in this case, this one is very good against that motion because it sits in your palm, but when it's against this motion, there's nothing really. There's only that little small portion if you can get your fingers and push down on it, and even then it just rolls out of your hand. So that handle design is what really plays a large factor into a karambit. And I would say that for people interested in the karambit, that handling one and knowing what you're looking for in the handle is probably the key. You know, beyond then is the blade positioned in the proper way so you can do, a poking motion. You can see, for me, example on this knife, I don't feel precise. I don't feel in control when I want to get that tip to meet a certain point. You're gonna have to practice that. Again, it's another technique that's specific to the karambit, that if I want to jab and hit a specific spot, I don't feel the control in this shape handle. And that's not good or bad. It's just saying that one doesn't have that, and it depends on if you're going to practice those techniques or not. You know, some hands, like I'll mention the Emerson ones. The Emerson karambits are great because they have the thickness, and so it really just stays in your hand, and almost too much, especially around the finger hole. I would say that might be a bad thing because you don't. Again, your index finger, that chance of it's getting caught. Perhaps you want less focus around your index finger, but more focus here, especially to keep it in your hand. You know, if you're a person who wants to learn how to use it in reverse grip, you know, what muscles you're gonna have to practice holding it and building up calences, building up that strength to hold it in a way that is not very normal. There's a lot of force being exerted in your hand because of that lever that is created. And so when you're holding it, perhaps in reverse grip, you know, the design of the knife so that it's secure in your hand. Overall, I would say a well-made, purpose-built karambit for tactical applications, I would say, is superior to than a traditional knife. There's so much more going on in what the blade can do, in what your hand has to learn how to do, what the techniques you have to practice, and just how much more focus built it is on being in a fight as opposed to a standard knife. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. Try to help provide some input into what I think a karambit should be, some of the features, depending on what you intend to do, whether you intend to hold in reverse grip, like I said. Do you want that flexibility, being able to add that jabbing motion in? Are you snagging or tearing? You know, those kind of concepts. A lot of them, there's just a lot to break down, a lot to understand if you're going to buy a karambit that's going to suit you. So I hope this video was helpful. I thank you for watching, supporting me. Please subscribe. I will continue uploading more videos on tactical knife discussions, along with also much more reviews, 7-point reviews, and whatever I can do to contribute to the knife community.